The other day I was scrolling the Nintendo eShop, as I am wont to do despite owning like 150 games on Switch, most of which I haven't played, but don't question my irrational ways. And I came across a game and thought to myself, I had no idea another Kirby game was released. Upon closer inspection, it was not in fact a Kirby game, but rather Whipseey and the Lost Atlas. A 2D platformer that is definitely not a Kirby game. No sir, not a Kirby clone at all. The game was only $6, so I picked it up, and guess what? It's totally a Kirby clone. The Kirby similarities delve much deeper than the titular Whipseey's striking resemblance to the pink puffball. Though I guess you can arguably make a case that Whipseey also looks a little like Igglybuff too. It has that like Igglybuff hair poof. Has that going for it too, but it's definitely Kirby, it's just Kirby. The whole aesthetic is remarkably similar to the NES and SNES 2D Kirby games. From the Waddle Dee-esque enemies to the classic arched doors between rooms to the spinies. Wait, those are from Mario? Which seems to be heavily referenced in the final level too. It's basically a Bowser's Castle level with these enemies that 100% sure aren't dry bones. No sir, definitely not dry bones here. To this definitely not a Kirby dance at the end of each level. Somebody likes Kirby an awful lot and was like, yo, what if we had a whip? And that is the core of Whipseey and the Lost Atlas. You spend the majority of the game platforming through stages, taking out enemies with your trusty whip. And it mostly works. The platforming is pretty precise, and the whip is mostly flexible and responsive, except when you have to use it as a grappling hook, where weirdly you have to land it from a little further away than you'd expect, usually resulting in you falling in pits when you mistime it. You can eventually work out that timing, but it's not the most intuitive in the world. Whipseey can also use the whip as a propeller to slow the descent of jumps, but that was more a source of frustration for me than anything else. In boss fights where you want to jump multiple times quickly to avoid things that are being flung at you, sometimes you just want to float down slower instead, but the propeller effect would get in the way. There was one much bigger source of my ire though. The level design seems to take glee in frustrating you. Your biggest source of deaths in this game will be knocked back into pits, over and over again. The vast majority of the game's platforming challenge is built around placing some enemy in the way of where you need to jump. It'll hit you, and you'll fall backwards into a pit. Again and again. It's so incredibly cheap and so incredibly common in this game. There's one room where you have a frog spitting seeds on one side of the room, and two thin platforms in the middle, both with an electric enemy on them. It sucks. Whipseey has 5 hit points and starts with 5 lives, gaining a life for every 100 gems you collect, but you will pretty much never die from losing HP, just being knocked back into pits. There's a point in the game's 3rd level where you have to bounce on the heads of moving enemies over a pit of death. This is the first time the game asks this of you. And if you get the timing wrong, you die! Even worse, in the next room, immediately after that, you have to do it from one enemy to the other. If you bounce off the first, mistime it, and float back to the start, you're screwed. That first enemy doesn't respawn. You just have to start and die again. You have to take like the shameful jump into the pit of death, all by yourself. Poor Whipseey, he deserves better than to die like that. In the very first level, there's a section that goes underwater with spikes that have the largest hitbox I've ever seen. Float next to them and you die. There are some unique enemy types, but for the most part, one crack of your whip and every enemy you come across will die. Except the Dry Bones clones. That definitely aren't Dry Bones. The game isn't all bad. The art style is pleasant and colourful, the music is cheerful and upbeat. When the platforming isn't super cheap, it's all charmingly engaging. There's a train section in the 4th level that's really neat. There's also a boss fight at the end of each level, all of which are actually really solid. There's just one problem though, the game has 5 levels. Whipseey is dragged into a storybook and you see a sort of overworld map to move from level to level. You assume, when you first play the game, that that is simply the first world. Nope. That's the whole game! Each level takes about 10 minutes less if you're better than me and can avoid the unfair deaths, leaving the whole game at less than an hour long. You look at the 100% completion rate on the main menu in disbelief. I have long championed short games. Games that can be beaten in one sitting are honestly the dream for me. And at €6, I can't really give out too much about the game only being an hour long, but it still feels like a demo. A proof of concept for an obvious Kirby clone rather than a full experience all its own. It's a shame that Whipseey relies so much on frustrating the player when there are kernels of a fun platforming experience in there. It's easy to transpose the look of something, but much harder to capture the feel and the spirit. And when a game is less than an hour long, it becomes pretty hard to recommend. Whipseey and the Lost Atlas gets 4.5 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching. I'm always interested in seeing games that are inspired by other games, that are very obviously taking heavy inspiration from other games, and seeing can they actually make it something all their own and something unique and something new. I just made a video about Shovel Knight after all, and Whipseey didn't get there, but alas. You can follow me on Twitter at GarrettKidneyGA or ETTKIDNEY. Leave a like or subscribe if you want to see me review more clones of video games, I guess. On your left, Why the Planes of Passage from Shovel Knight is real darn good, and on your right, a review of Vice Project Doom on the NES. Thanks for watching.